Hello, my name is Ernesto Domínguez López. I'm a professor of history at the University of Havana, Cuba, and a Tinker visiting professor at the University of Stanford University. One of my lines of research, one that is actually very important for me, my country, but also for the United States and for the whole of the Americas, is the relationship between the United States and Cuba, relationships that have been going on for about 200 years or more, and they have had a number of ups and downs, and they have a very critical nature. So I'm going to be talking about this in the hope that we get to a better understanding of what the relationship is, what it is, the way in which it is, and to figure out a way to move forward in this, or something that could be helpful for all of you at some point. The most important part, or the most important starting point to understand Cuba-US relations have to do with where Cuba is. In a map, you can see very easily how close Cuba is to the United States, the shore of the United States, and how well located it is in an area that is extremely important, historically speaking, in something that happens to be the first of the key factors that are needed to understand the history of Cuba and that are critical to understand the history of Cuba's relations, that geographical location. Also the fact that the Cuban economy is largely dependent on its foreign trade, foreign investment, the relationship with other actors around the world, what is called an open economy in that sense. Also, these two things have led Cuba to have a very intense relationship with global powers in different moments in history. That goes all the way back to the Spanish colonial time. Cuba was a colony of Spain for about 400 years. To the United States when it became a global power, but also other major powers in history, the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, when it started to have a presence in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War years. All of that have been major parts of Cuban history, as it is a movement of people that I encapsulate in the word migration, but in fact encompasses a number of things, including, very importantly, the import of enslaved people from Africa that made a significant part of the Cuban population until today. Their descendants make a significant part of the Cuban population until today. So Cuban history has to be understood considering all of these factors. And we are talking about the geographical location, the open economy. All of that translates into Cuba being at the very center of a very dense network of trade that was critical during colonial times. It was the key position in the Spanish colonial empire, especially to its location at the hub of Spanish colonial trade, a reality that even when changed due to the changes in the global geopolitics, the global maps have changed significantly. Still, Cuba is located at the very center of a very dense network of trade, as it can be seen in modern maps that track these trade routes and the way in which they operate. The most intense one, many of them are around Cuba in the what is called the American Mediterranean. So, on that base, Cuban history have gone through a number of major turning points, from the discovery, because there was people living in Cuba, so discovery not so much, but the arrival of the Spaniards in 1492 and the subsequent conquest and colonization. The Haitian Revolution, who didn't happen in Cuba, but had a huge impact in the country because, of course, it made Cuba, it created a vacuum in the sugar markets in the world and allowed Cuba to become the biggest producer and exporter of sugar in the world, which is something that shaped Cuban history ever since. The Cuban Independence Wars itself, and a couple of revolutions that happened in the country. One in 1933 and one in 1959, that is the best known of the events in Cuban history, the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And a later event that didn't happen in Cuba either, but was very impactful. The collapse of socialism, as it's actually called, not communism, socialism in Eastern Europe, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991. All of that eventually produced major change, major shifts in Cuban history. When you compare that to U.S. history, because we have two countries here, we have to go through different, also important turning points in U.S. history. It's on colonization by the Brits, although the colonization started before by the Spaniards, and there were a number of people living in what is today the United States. But as the United States emerged from the British colonies, we are talking about early 1600s, sorry. And from that moment on, during the independence of the United States, the territorial expansion, the Civil War, and then all the developments in late 1800s and in the 2000s, and the 1900s and the early 21st century, with the projection of the United States as a global power. One of the big components in US history have been this idea of having a foreign policy that is based on some foundations. There are a couple of documents that actually show the relevance and the orientation of that foreign policy. For example, the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, written by John Quincy Adams, although announced by President James Monroe in that year in the Massachusetts Congress, which is the State of the Union Address. Currently it's called the State of the Union Address. And something that is not an official document, but effectively provided an ideological framework for this foreign policy, which is the Manifest Destiny by John O'Sullivan in 1845, when both of these documents were talking about not only the projection of the United States as the main power in the Western Hemisphere, but declaring its right to control the hemisphere as a way to bring progress to the land, but also the right provided by destiny, by providence, of controlling the region because of the reason of being the most civilized people in the whole hemisphere, in the whole continent. That's a very simplified way of putting this, more to it, but it's very important to understand because that means that anybody that's in the surroundings of the United States will be a target for this kind of idea, for this kind of potential expansion. Regarding Cuba in particular, there is something that is called the ripe fruit theory by John Quincy Adams himself. And he was talking that Cuba will fall in the lap of the United States as a ripe fruit will fall from the tree because of the laws of political gravity, something like that. Pretty much providing a sort of a scientific basis for the idea of the United States in being potentially in control of Cuba in the future. All of those ideas eventually translated into the expansion of the United States all the way from the East Coast, today's East Coast, to the Pacific, to the conquest of the Mexican territories in the 1840s, to the acquisition of Louisiana, after the acquisition of Louisiana in 1803, the acquisition of Alaska, the annexation of Hawaii, and in those very same years, United States demonstrated a very intense, very important interest in acquiring Cuba that is present even in the writings and the speeches of the founding fathers. They were talking about Cuba as the most interesting acquisition that the new republic could have, or a necessary condition for the survival of the United States in the context of heightened tensions. This is in the early times of the United States as an independent country, in the relationship with the Brits in particular, or the attempts to buy Cuba from Spain. The actual United States offered up to $300 million gold in the 1800s, which is about 40 times, it's 20 times as much as they offered, paid, in fact, for the whole Louisiana territory, which is not current Louisiana, is all the Mississippi Valley. It's a big chunk of land, and yet Cuba, much smaller land, much more territory, was offered 20 times as much in the time in which the value of the currency didn't change that much. So that is telling in itself how important, how interesting, how attractive Cuba was for these elites, which also was reinforced by the fact that, especially in the 1800s, when the Cuban sugar industry began to boom, the two countries entered in a very intense and growing economic relationship based on trade, with the Cuban sugar flowing mostly into the United States to the point in which it went to up to 90% to the United States. And also with investment coming the other way around, American business persons coming to Cuba, some of them settling in Cuba, trying to expand their presence in the country. And all of that was at the very basis of United States projection and interest in Cuba. That's why its subsequent policies during the Cuban independence wars is so interesting, because initially the United States decided not to support the Cuban attempt to get its independence. This happened in 1868 through 1878 because they were afraid, and there are speeches that demonstrate this, the government of the United States was afraid that an independent Cuba without the immediate control of the United States itself, or without the control of Spain, will fall into the hands of the Great Britain, and that will be so much difficult for the US then to make its inroads and get to control the country. That changed by 1895, when the last Cuban independence war started, and they orchestrated a significant, some important journalists like William Randolph Hearst orchestrated a massive PR campaign, one of the very first of these types in history, to generate support for an intervention that eventually happened and led to the so-called Spanish-American War, that in fact involved Cubans and Filipinos that were fighting for independence for years, in which I like to call the Spanish-Cuban Filipino-American War. It's a more accurate term if you want. That intervention, essentially combined with these independence wars for the case of Cuba, brought with it two very different ways of approaching the reality. On the one hand, in the Cuban side, you see that the independence war is considered the very basis and the starting point of Cuban national identity and the glorious past of the fighters who fought and died for independence. As you can see in some of the paintings and the picture of the time, there is a heroic vision of that. Whereas on the American side, at the very same time, the idea was that Cuba was, and at the time, the feminization of country meant saying that the country was weak and in need of protection. The idea of Cuba as a damsel in distress vis-a-vis the Spanish bandit criminal, then the US as essentially the knight in shining armor that had to step in and protect Cuba. That was a way in which it was presented, and that supported the intervention and the creation of what effectively became a protectorate. Protectorate, why? Because there was not only military occupation at the beginning, but a legal framework that established that the US had the right to intervene in Cuba during militarily speaking, and actually happened quite a few times. But also had economic control and overall political control in the country, in exchange for protection from external threats. That is a textbook case of a protectorate, which is in fact a form of colony. So all the way since early 1900s, I will say 1899, when the military occupation started, to the 1930s, Cuba was in effect a colony of the United States, which at the time had a few other colonies. Still have a couple of them around, like the overseas territories, but at the time Cuba was one of those, even when in a very specific condition. That changed in the 1930s, not before leaving some marks in Cuba. You can go around Cuba and you can see for example, what is called the Capitol building, pretty much like the one in Washington, inspired by the one in Washington, a little bit smaller building but taller. That's very important. It's 2 feet taller on the needle on top of the main boat. It is truly 2 feet taller, the building, which was the site of the Cuban Congress and was built in 1929 as an expression of the influence of the United States in Cuban culture, and influence that have been going on for many, many years, because the children of the Cuban elite have been coming to the United States to study, and there have been this exchanging for all of this time. So we can see not only the economic and political interests, but also these cultural ties that were built on the time. And also we can see how many of the people who led the Cuban independence effectively lived in the United States for a while and created organizations and gathered resources to support the effort for independence here in the States, for example in Key West, for example in Tampa, and a significant group in Miami, including the biggest leader of the Cuban independence war, Jose Marti, who lived for 15 years in New York. That was a very important imprint. But all of that meant at the same time that Cuba was not independent, and the Cuban history is essentially a history of building an independent nation. The whole idea is that. That's why in the 1930s there was another revolution that incorporated not only, of course, the problem of sovereignty, but also domestic issues. There was a dictatorship going in Cuba, and there was a significant historical process known as the 1930s revolution in Cuba, in the context also of the Great Depression, by the way, who was impacted Cuba directly. So the consequence of this for the relationship between Cuba and the United States was a significant change in the nature of that, when it went from being a protectorate to be what is called a neo-colony. Neo-colony now is a new form of control that doesn't include a legal framework that supports political control. There is economic control, but there is then indirect control through the means of using local proxies. In the Cuban case, for example, because it is very common, the military served as that proxy, and some of the political leaders served as those proxies. The United States supported several dictatorships at the time, in the 1930s, and then in 1952, another one. And this eventually meant that Cuba remained, even when no longer a colony, it remained not fully sovereign, and still accumulating a number of social issues. All of this led to the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which, by the way, came in the heels of a significant, still important and growing and ongoing presence of United States culture and its impact on Cuba that you can see in certain neighborhoods in Havana until today, Havana, the Cuban capital, which you can see the urbanistic developments and the architecture that was typical of the 1940s and 50s in modern cities in the United States. With a twist, it's a tropical country, different conditions, but still you can see tall buildings, wide avenues, with wide sidewalks with trees and parks, all of that was part of the modernization of the city under the influence of the United States. But the Cuban Revolution was not against that, it was against the lack of sovereignty and, of course, against the questions like huge inequalities, a massive dictatorship or a dictatorship in power at the time. And the Cuban Revolution also had a huge geopolitical connotation. Why? Because it essentially, let's say, opened a crack in the US regional structure that supported the position of a global power. The US needed what is called national security, which is not necessarily the protection of the people and the territory, but the protection of the interests, and that it required the control of territories in the region as per the Monroe Doctrine and all these foundational documents. The Cuban Revolution opened a hole in that structure, and that happened in the midst of the Cold War. So the reaction against this on the American side will have been hostile nonetheless in any conditions, but when you add to the mix the Cold War, the ongoing Cold War with the Soviet Union, then it became even more clear that the reaction will be hostile no matter what. That's why US policy towards Cuba during those years became one of hostility and conflict. As at the same time, the USSR the Soviet Union found an opportunity, and Cuba, in the context in which it experienced, for example, almost from the get-go, increasing economic pressure, sanctions, cutting economic ties with the United States, and economy that depending on that, which were crafted with the idea of creating discontent among the Cuban population based on the lack of resources, on economic hardship, and all of that, as have been written in documents that are available online, by the way, as of now, that forced a Cuban hand in looking for other alternatives that were not the United States. And that cemented the relationship with the Soviet Union at the same time that the United States was implementing in this hostile policy a number of actions, many of which will be labeled now as terrorism. At the time were not used and was not classified in that way, but there is no way around, along with military threats and all of that. In fact, one of the major events in this history, which is the missile crisis from 1962, is not the starting point of anything but a consequence of the increasing hostility and the increasing conflictive nature of the relationship and the threat that Cuba felt that was the United States, and trying to find a way to protect itself. I'm not saying it's the right decision. It actually opened the door to many other things that was part of that logic. When the Soviet Union disappeared and things in the world changed so quickly, because actually in 2 years is nothing, Cuba faced again the situation, the reality of being without trade partners, without political supporters, without allies, in general, with very little in the sense of economic relations outside at the time the socialist bloc, because the US sanctions remained in place. The US had the opportunity to change things a little bit and find a modus vivendi, but in fact the US doubled down, increasing sanctions and forcing Cuba to adapt. For example, to create urban farms as a way to cope with the lack of imports of food, for example, in different moments, to try to figure out ways to reorganize its economy, but also trying to diversify its foreign relations. And that was met with new sanctions. As we can see, every year that we have actually tracked, there are more studies ongoing, and we can actually confidently say that they have been the case for the better at least 50 years. But so far, what we have tracked with all the numbers, we have for more than 20 years, since the 1990s onwards, new sanctions every year, with some moments in which some of the sanctions have been scrapped, but those have been the ones that no longer make any sense, or just in one moment with President Obama, in which he actually tried to change his policy a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that the relationship has remained a conflictive one, and the reality of it is that it's not, I don't think there is a immediate future in which the relationship won't be conflictive. That being said, we still remain very close culturally speaking. There are two of the people that can actually understand each other when we get along, because many parts of Cuban history, the Cuban culture, the Cuban identity have been forged in the relationship with the United States, whether for separating ourselves from the United States or whether due to the influence being part of that, of the habits and the practices that we have every day, from the time in which we eat or the way in which we call things. We take American expressions and make them into Spanish words, and that's how we call a lot of things. That's why we have a different way of speaking Spanish than Mexicans, for example, or South Americans. That is a large part of it. So you have a very complex system, which you have this history of conflict, coupled with this history of interactions that go beyond the conflict to create ties that are not easily broken in the process. So the future is still unknown, but in my view, these two things will keep on going.